My name is Nicholas Campling, and I'm the Secretary of the Gerry Holdsworth Special Forces Trust. We're very lucky to have with us today Professor Michael Foot, who is the foremost authority on matters to do with SOE, and we felt that an interview or a series of interviews would be far more interesting to you than reading rather pithy letters and figures. So, Michael, thank you very much for joining us. What I'd like to do first, if I may, is to ask you, what really set SOE going?
The Irish War of 1919-21, in which we had a resistance movement used against us with substantial success. Michael Collins, who never commanded as many as 3,000 armed men, saw the back of about 60,000 troops and armed police and established the Irish Free State. And we took a knock from that and remembered it. And when, 20 years later, it looked as if we were going to have the same thing to do again, fighting Germany, the chiefs of staff, all of whom vividly remembered the Anglo-Irish War, it was part of those mission present, remembered what had been going on. And as far back as the 19th of May 1940, were considering what the Joint Planning Staff called a certain eventuality that they didn't even dare to put down on paper, which was the possibility that France might break. And the Chiefs of Staff then resolved, and told the Cabinet so on the 25th of May, that if France broke, we might just survive, given that we had undoubted American help, but with only two possible counterstrokes. Whatever the Royal Air Force could conjure up with Bomber Command, and whatever we could conjure up with resistance forces on the continent. Back in 1938, 3 bodies had been started up in London to do some work on this. The Secret Intelligence Service sprouted a new division, first called Section 9, Roman 9, and then called Section D, to work on propaganda and sabotage and how one ought to think about stimulating. The War Office happened to contain a sapper major called Joe Holland, who had just failed his medical for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, having been wounded in Dublin 20 years earlier, and was offered as a soft job till he restored his health, a post as a General Staff Officer, second grade, to research into any subject he liked. He said, fine, I shall research into irregular warfare. And settled down to work up what the Irish had done against him, what Lawrence and the Arabs had done against the Turks, what had been going on in China and in Spain.
And put it all together.
Put it all together. The third body came under the Foreign Office. It was usually called EH, after Electra House on the embankment where it worked. It was sometimes called CS, after Sir Campbell Stewart, who headed it. Campbell Stewart had done wonders in 1917-18 under Lord Northcliffe, wrecking the morale of the German army, and was to consider what could be done about propaganda abroad. He was paid for out of the Foreign Office vote, but he didn't appear on the Foreign Office list, nor did any of his staff. And in June 1940, when France did collapse, there was a fearful flap in Whitehall, and all 3 bodies were thrown together in the 3rd week of July to form SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which was a new secret service to run sabotage and subversion against the enemy. That was how it began.
Fascinating. This trust is named after a very worthy SOE sailor, and our first chairman was indeed yet another such well-known SOE sailor. These two, Gerry Holdsworth and Brooks Richards, What exactly did they get up to at Helford? Because it is not that clear, even from the books that have been written about it.
Luckily, we've got a very good book by Sir Brooks called Secret Flotillas, now in 2 volumes, which explains in pretty minute detail what they were up to at Helford, and subsequently when he went out to North Africa and ran agents from North Africa into the south of France. To start with, from Helford, he ran agents into Brittany.
Yes. Pontevin, presumably. To Pontevin.
Among many others.
Among others. Yes.
Among several places. He had incessant difficulties with the Secret Intelligence Service,
Yes.
which remained jealous of SOE from the start, because its Section D had been taken away from it and thrown into SOE. Nobody remembered to tell the head of the service for 3 weeks that he'd lost it. He was furious, and under that bureaucratic sight continued to smart for years thereafter. As late as September 44, I found him trying to sow mines in SOE's path. This was really a quite trivial personal quarrel between himself and Colin Gubbins, the mainspring of SOE, both very plausible, very polite men who happened to detest each other. Just bad luck. But I come back to Brooks Richards and Gerry Holdsworth.
Yes.
Gerry had been up to I don't quite know what.
Before
the war.
Yes.
I imagine he was employed by Six, but it cast up with him finding himself on working before the mast on a tramp steamer in the Baltic, from which he managed to get back to England just in time. Brooks Richards had been up at Cambridge, where he had done some work on small boats with which he was very good, and had joined the RNVR when the war began. And SOE's man down in Cornwall went to call on Commander-in-Chief Plymouth. SOE had a rule, always deal with the man at the top. He went to call on Commander-in-Chief Plymouth and said, "Can you spare us an officer or two?" And the Commander-in-Chief said, "I can't think of it. I'm completely blocked. I haven't a man to spare." At that moment there was a boom out to sea. He picked up his glasses and said, if he survives that, you can have Brooks Richards.
Oh,
Brooks Richards' minesweeper had just been blown up by mines that did best, and he survived and was handed over to SOE, and he and Gerry Holdsworth settled down on the Helford River and compiled a fleet of small boats which could pass for French fishing specs and go and operate into Brittany, aided by something they'd picked up from the Royal Air Force, a retired air sea rescue boat called 390, which was quite fast, quite nimble, and had a little storage space on it, and could be used to slip under the radar and again go into Britain and deliver men and stores. And they settled down to do it for the next 2 years.
2 years. That is fascinating.
There was a rule imposed by the Admiralty that none of these sorties could take place without the permission of Commander-in-Chief Plymouth, which he willingly gave. And to start with, they were accompanied out across the Channel by a squadron of Spitfires to keep an eye on them. Somebody said the Germans will notice this on radar, it's very dangerous, so they gave it up. Thereafter they went unescorted and trusted to their luck, which usually held. And they moved, I forget the figures, but they're all in my book. They moved some hundreds of agents to and fro between France and Cornwall. And it answered well.
Perhaps you'd like to tell us something about the Norwegian heavy water exploit. Now, not that long ago, we were both at Brickendenbury, which was
Well, we
Station
helped to unveil
17.
the plaque. That's it.
And we mentioned it then, and I wonder if you'd like to tell us some more about it now.
Back before the previous World War, Rutherford had established at the University of Manchester that the atom, which by its name indicates something you can't split, might be splittable. By 1938, it was becoming clear to the international physics community that the atom might, after all, be splittable, and that if you split it, you might get a bomb of tremendous power. There was a woman called Lisa Meitner who was working on this at the University of Berlin. There was a man called Enrico Fermi, who was an Italian citizen, who was working on it at the University of Chicago, where he had leave. And there was a man called Heisenberg in Berlin, next to Einstein, the world's leading physicist, who was also starting to take an interest in it. Lisa Meitner got out early, bringing with her the key to the secret, which she put into an article in a learned journal she thought a scientist ought to do. So the leading scientists the world over were aware of this. And Einstein wrote to Roosevelt in 1939 and said, this is a possibility, the United States ought to be aware of it. And Roosevelt became aware of it. But the Germans were ploughing ahead with trying to create it. And the way Heisenberg wanted to get to it was through a substance called heavy water, deuterium oxide, of which the Germans' only source was in Norway, which they had just conquered in April to June 1940, in a factory at a place called Febok, west of Oslo. And there they were producing heavy water in some quantities. The commandos were told to dispose of this and mounted an operation called Freshman. 2 Halifaxes full of commandos set off for Norway.
A bit of a disaster, wasn't it?
One flew into the side of a mountain. The other came back without its glider. Both gliders crashed. All the crew were captured and they were carrying marked maps. So the garrison of Febok was reinforced and all the commandos were shot as a routine German act of reprisal against supposed terrorism. Bomber Command took it over, made no impact. United States Air Force Bomber Command took it over, made no impact. SOE took it over by luck. A man called Einars Kinderland, who was the chief engineer at the factory making these things, had 3 weeks leave and caught the Shetland bus, which was a fishing boat that ran between the west coast of Norway and the Orkneys. And he turned up in the Orkneys 2 days later and said, here I am in Kilmahill. And SOE picked him up, trained him as a parachutist, told him what to do and parachuted him back. And he turned up at the end of his 3 weeks leave and went back to work and received a few days later a party of parachutists who had come in on the plateau above Febok and came down and arrived in the middle of the night, tied up the guards with parachute cord to prove that they were British, nothing to do with Norway at all, and put bombs on the transformer house. Without the transformer house, the factory couldn't work. And they retired away up the hill and got back eventually to England. 2 of them stayed behind, having heard from one of the guards while they were tying him up that the factory had just sent off about 100 kilograms of heavy water on their way to Berlin, which they pursued. And they found they had to cross at one point a ferry, a lake by ferry. Just before the ferry sailed, a couple of chaps went on board it in brown coats, job to do in the engine room, did the job in the engine room, left a haversack behind. The ferry set off over the lake. There was a quiet pop in the middle of the lake and the ferry sank. And there are still large quantities of heavy water lying on the bottom of Lake Dinshaw if anybody cares to go and fish them up. This was a very neat operation, but it stopped Hitler getting an atomic bomb.
Absolutely.
Because Heisenberg went to the General Staff and said, I'm stuck. They've stolen my heavy water. I can do nothing. The General Staff said, how long will it take you to get going again? Heisenberg said, about 3 years. General Staff said, too late. In 3 years' time, either we will have won the war or we will have lost it. Give it up. The Führer would rather you worked on jet engines. That was the end of Hitler's attempt to get a bomb. If Hitler had got a bomb, neither of us would be sitting here today.
No.
Quite. The great Thomas,
Yes.
on his way back to England from Paris, taking a train from Paris to Amiens. Just as he approached the station, a friend met him and said, "Ah, Tommy, thank God, look after this for me." Handed him a suitcase crammed with intelligence material. There was Tommy with this impossibly compromising document. Travelled in the same carriage as a party of German officers, put it in among their luggage, where of course nobody thought of searching it. And turned up at the far end, took it off, and wafted it through. All you need is very steady nerves.
Yes.
If you've got them, you're home. And if you haven't got them, what are you doing in the Secret Service?
But I think you personally had a very narrow escape, did you not?
I had a whole series of very narrow
But
escapes.
particularly through wearing your SAS wings.
I was saved by the mercy of Providence.
Yes.
I was taken prisoner. And a souvenir collector went past us. Excuse me, sir, I haven't got that one. Whipped out his pocket knife and cut off my SAS wing. Thus leaving me dressed as a captain in Airborne Royal Artillery, an identity which I adopted without a moment's tremor, and successfully.
Because had they realised...
Had they realised I was SAS, they'd have shot me.
Well, there you are.
Out of 100 SAS taken prisoner, 6 came back,
Yes.
of whom I was one. By pure luck.
But you were going to tell us something about Tony Brooks.
Tony
who
Brooks,
was a
I
member of this club, and we all knew and loved well.
I knew him and loved him
I
too,
know.
a long time ago. An extraordinary story he told me once. One of his covers was that he was a garage hand at Montauban in the south of France, north of Toulouse. And he missed, by accident, the BBC messages on the night of the 1st of May 1944, when the BBC, by mistake, called out the whole of French resistance. But he heard them on the 1st of June, 44. And he sent for his landlord's daughters, of whom the elder was 16, and said, "Go ahead, my dears, do it this week." And they set off by bicycle to go round the villages round Montauban, where in every village railway station, in a siding, there were a couple of worn-out railway vans parked with vine leaves over both ends of them. Under the railway vans, there were tanks belonging to the SS Panzer Division, carefully concealed from air observation.
Yeah.
And the girls made a killing on the black market because they siphoned off from the tanks all their sump oil and replaced it with abrasive grease provided by Tony. And on the morning of the 6th of June, all the debris was swept away and the tanks were brought into Montauban and joined up with their crews in a barracks in the centre of Montauban, which Tony was unable to attack. And on the morning of the 7th of June, they were loaded, the tank transporters were loaded up with their tanks and set off for Normandy, under load with the abrasive grease in their sumps. None of them went as far as 3 miles without breaking down. There were the tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Division scattered over the countryside round Montauban, helpless and livid. And they got off their transporters and hobbled over to Pedigo, which was 60 miles away, ambushed quite frequently on the way, where they could get onto trains which would take them up to Normandy. But this delayed the division's arrival in Normandy. It was due in Normandy on D+4, wasn't identified in Normandy until D+17. Thanks largely to 2 teenage girls who knew what to do and did it at the right moment. It's a wonderful story of how force applied correctly by somebody who knows how to do it can work.
Michael, thank you very much for those stories, which are both entertaining and certainly from my point of view fill in odd corners where my own knowledge has not perhaps been as much as it might have been. Thank you very much for doing it, and we appreciated you coming in. Thank you.
Delight. Thank you for asking.